Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought it was time to circle back to China. What has been happening there recently, Jim?
Well, they have said that they're not going to do anything aggressive. Well, they've actually ordered their personnel not to act aggressively. And that's usually a sign that they're going to basically wait until the American election is over. On a larger, canvas, China is still faced with the same problems. They cannot afford a war. They can afford a war less than anybody else. They are in a situation somewhat similar to Japan in 1940 or 41. They import almost all their oil. They've been stockpiling it mainly because of, Iran has been eager to unload as much as they can. And of course, they had the COVID-19 recession, which has slowed their economy down, but that's coming back up. But they, the pollution is now building up in the cities again, which is one irrefutable way to calculate how their economy is doing. The air was actually clear for a while, and so that was confirmation that yes, they've shut down large portions of their economy because of the virus. They still have the problem in that the government is a communist police state. The economy is a market economy. In other words, there's still corruption. There's still interference by state officials, which is very unpopular with the majority of Chinese. The government is very much afraid of what this new middle class might do. For one thing, there's so many of them. China never had a middle class like this before. I mean, they had something of a middle class, but these were basically non-commercial. They had merchants and what have you, but it was not a large class. These were wealthy merchants. The wealth was concentrating at the top. But in the last 20, 30 years, they've developed a real middle class. People who they own their own apartment or home, usually an apartment. They own a car. They own things. They have education. They have skills, marketable skills. The Chinese government, as well as Chinese commercial firms, compete to hire these people. One very smart thing that Chinese have done is that they have taken more and more of the weapons development away from state-owned companies and basically allowed competition. Now, a lot of what this means is a lot of Chinese weapons developers will develop a weapon mainly for export because they haven't got any assurance of sales to the Chinese military. But if the weapon proves itself, bingo, the military will, start purchasing this proven system. A lot of times it doesn't work. But again, these are commercial firms, and the government understands that they're not going to develop a lot of these freebie, systems, as it were, without government assistance, if they don't sell them, they don't export them. China is dependent on exports in many vital industries. They are still dependent on imports for many critical elements, especially some electronics and food. Now, here's where the great vulnerability is. If there's a war, their ports are not functioning anymore. I mean, forget about, the Americans or Japanese or South Koreans mining those ports. There's also the fact that the insurance companies will not insure a lot of ships. Now, China has a large merchant fleet, but they're going to be free, prize, as it were, out on the open seas, because if there's a war, they're going to be hunted down, forced to surrender, and whatever country gets them, has a new ship, a bulk, cargo, tanker, you name it. So they're crippled. So they, like the Japanese in 1941, have to win a war fast. Now, here's another big variable. If you war game this out, you're faced with one major question mark. How well will everybody's weapon systems work? Now, one characteristic of Chinese weapon systems, they look great, they test pretty good as far as we can tell. They're putting their pilots into the air to basically get the air time that creates a competent pilot, something the Russians could never do during the communist period, or actually even since, because letting the pilots fly their planes 1 or 200 hours a year is very expensive. But the Chinese realize that, and they're starting to do it. But they still have, an incredibly small air force compared to, well, even South Korea and Japan, which are the other two military superpowers in East Asia. I mean, you put the United States forces deployed in the West Pacific, along with South Korea and Japan. China is way outnumbered. Now, the Chinese do this. One thing they inherited from the Soviets was a thing called correlation of forces. And this is something that's actually key to any war game. They do use some modern war games. They've been doing it since the 70s. When I was running a war games company, I got visited by the FBI, who were looking at some people who were exporting illegal weapons to China. And so I said, well, what are you doing here? He says, well, your war games are considered, weapons grade, intellectual property. I said, well, nobody ever told me. He said, all right, sure, go look at our list. Now, I don't know if they ever found the people they were looking for, but even then, that was probably Andy Marshall and company who were pointing out that, if the people in the Department of Defense thought our games were so effective, what do you think the Chinese will think? Or the Russians? Well, the Russians really wouldn't admit it, but the Chinese were eager for any Western technology. And so some of the first Western technology they got were games I designed. Dubious distinction. Now, fast forward almost 40 years later, they have the second largest economy in the world, and they're no longer a continental power. Continental power is a country that doesn't depend upon imports and exports by sea. In other words, they either have everything they need within their borders, or they have, neighbors, with land borders, who can provide what they need, or be invaded and occupied and be forced to give up what the continental power requires. A classic example of that was Germany. Germany was a continental power, and England was a maritime power. And in the end, Britain won, in part because they control the seas. So that still applies. It just goes to show you what goes around comes around. This goes back thousands of years. I mean, the ancient history, stories of wars and what have you, are rife with examples of maritime control equals a fantastic weapon. Now, the problem with China is they do not know how effective their modern forces would be in trying to break or reduce the American or the American alliance. Again, we're including South Korea and Japan. The enemy's ability to basically cut off China from the rest of the world by sea. China still has land links, but they cannot provide the kind of the degree of exports that China requires to keep its economy going. Now, these things we know. If there is more unemployment in China, the government is blamed. The government is in trouble. They've tried to play the nationalist card. That's one reason why they recently ordered their forces, do not fire first. You've got to take the first shot, because it's got to look like China's the victim. This is something Japan played at the end of the war, even though all through the war they were the ones getting the first shot, and if they could. But China has learns from the past, and they realize that not making the first move is not is mainly a domestic political issue, because they have to convince the Chinese people, who will be unemployed, going hungry, seeing their middle class status melting away, as long as China cannot trade. Now, where do you go from there? It's hard to say. But if China's weapons somehow work out, and you only find this sort of thing out when there's actually a war. We've reported, again and again, American weapons and other countries' weapons being tried out in combat. America's had more combat experience in the last 20, 30 years than any other country. Um, the Russians got involved in Syria mainly to test their weapons. They found a lot of errors. They found a lot of weapon systems they thought were great, and they turned out to be turkeys. Now, the Russians, to their credit, they admitted a lot of it eventually. They made fixes. They've really done more updating of their weapon systems, in the last 10 years than they had any time, even during the Soviet period, where it was a crime against the state to badmouth, Russian weapons. But we found out towards the end of the war, when I finally convinced the CIA to go and to interview a lot of these immigrants, the Russian immigrants that came in the 1980s because of the deal, to let Russian Jews. Well, a lot of those Russian Jews weren't Jews; they just bribed their way, to get the right papers to come to Brighton Beach and do whatever they could do. But what these people were, all of them had been in the military. Even if they hadn't been in high positions, they could see, they could hear, they could observe. And man, it was I got a couple of pats on the back for that, because they got an enormous amount of practical information on what the Russians could do and what they couldn't do. And in part, I did this to prove my point. In the games, we were doing contemporary games, I says, you cannot assume the Russians will do what they think they can do. You cannot even assume that they will do what our, experts, like Andy Marshall was well aware of his inability to accurately, predict, or calculate exactly what the enemy could do in the first stage of the war. The opening stages of any war, especially in modern time where there's a lot of new technology. In the past, you had weapons that have been used, for centuries. And so you pretty much knew what a spear could do, what a sword could do. There was no technology change to worry about. But now it's almost all about technology change. It's also about how well you train your troops. China, for example, issues that affect the military as a whole, they do not classify discussions. They have their periodicals. This is something even the Russians did. And one thing they're complaining about is 30 years of trying to build up an NCO corps has not worked. They still have got, without putting too fine a point on it, second-rate NCOs. Now, as any military historian or veteran in the West knows, the NCOs, the quality of your NCOs is basically the quality of your force. You can have the greatest officers in the world. You can have the greatest troops in the world, but it's the NCOs, the sergeants, the chief petty officers, and what have you. They are the glue that holds it all together and makes it work. And the West realized that a long time ago. But the Russians and the Chinese, following the Russian example, got rid of the NCOs because they noted during the Russian and to the Chinese Revolution, well, especially the Russian Revolution, it was these NCOs who were basically the most effective revolutionaries. These guys were skilled, they were practical, they had the support of the troops. They weren't some distant figure, like a lot of the officers were. These were guys that you could identify with. A lot of them were basically, people who were drafted. In those days, you drafted by lot, pretty much, or depending on how many bribes you could pay, for 20 years. And so these guys, they made the most of it. And so a guy who was 15 years veteran, who was a sergeant in the Russian army, this is a capable guy. And the Russians threw that all away. And it killed him, so to speak, literally, in World War II. Now, the Chinese saw that. They tried to fix it, but they haven't been able to. They're having a similar problem with their naval petty officers. They've been expanding the Navy rapidly in the last 10 years, and that simply is not enough time to select the more competent people and to basically give them the experience to become very efficient chief petty officers. I picked up, rumors, as it were, from people observing the Chinese who make port calls. They did a lot of this in the last 5-6 years as they got long distance shipping, and they could send out task forces. And they would say, generally speaking, they would send their contribution to the Somali anti-piracy task force when their 3-month tour was up. They would go off to Europe or South America, whatever, and basically show the flag, but mainly give the sailors, the crews, a practical experience in making long voyages, staying alive, as it were, on the open seas, which is no easy thing to do. But we do not know how much that cumulative rush to accumulate experience, which America has. Most Western navies have, especially the American Navy, mainly not because of incompetent things the Pentagon might be doing, the naval senior leadership, but simply because those ships staying at sea for 6 months, or more at a time, that's the kind of training you cannot get any other way. They know what to do. A storm, a failure at sea, equipment failure, they get right to it. They know what to do and they fix it. The Chinese are going for a quick victory, but even that is questionable. For example, the missiles they recently fired made a big stink. Some of them were the DF-21D. That's their anti-carrier ballistic missile. Now, that has never been tested, as far as we know, well, in the open sea, and this is apparently the first time. They test these things. They test most of their ballistic missiles. The country's so big, they fire them from one end of the country to the other, and that basically hides. It makes it more difficult for foreign countries to monitor what's going on. But they fired a 4,000-kilometer range, an intermediate range ballistic missile, and which would be aimed at Guam or something like that, or Okinawa. And this DF-21, which would be fired at any carrier task force trying to enter the South China Sea or get involved. Now, again, we don't know. As far as we know, they might have had it set, all right, to aim for this patch of water. Nobody knows what patch of water, and let's see if it hits. And so they can report back. They have telemetry coming out of the Warhead, encrypted telemetry. For all I know, we can cache that and decrypt it. I don't know that sort of thing you keep secret. But a more realistic test would be to put basically a large tanker or a large ship headed for the scrapyard and have what we call a SINK-X. And put it out there in the open sea, maybe keep the engine going under robotic control so it's got some speed like a carrier would be, and then fire the DF-21. Now, that's an expensive test, but it's the acid test. If they could pass that, we would see that. And if that ballistic missile came in and sank that old, that 30-year-old, retired carrier, bulk carrier or tanker, whoops, we got a problem. But we don't know. The Chinese don't know. And that's the problem in any opening stages of a war. But behind that, you've got to look at what we call in war games victory conditions. Their victory conditions are to stay in power. I mean, that's something the Chinese Communist Party has reinforced in the last 10 years. And we reported about it in Strategy Page. They've reinforced the fact that the armed forces do not pledge loyalty to China, but to the Chinese Communist Party. And they've also reorganized the chain of command so it flows, more so to the Communist Party than to any, there's no civilian authority in China. That you can get away with that as long as the economy is going great, people are prosperous, and so on. But the coronavirus, outbreak, and the recession it triggered, as well as the pushback China's getting in many other places, it means the Xi government, that he's now made himself, president for life, which wasn't that way for about 20 years. He is under pressure because it's all on him. When things were going swell, he could take credit. It's me, Chairman Xi. But now when things are going bad, he doesn't realize, even in a police state, people think, he's screwing up. If we get rid of him, maybe things will get better. Now, people think that, and they can pick it up in the chatter on the internet. And that basically gives Xi, the senior leadership, pause on doing anything aggressive. They feel, and this is an old Chinese, military strategy, that it's more prudent, safer, and more assured if you are the superior power, which China always has been for over a couple thousand years. Once it unified, you will eventually prevail without risk, to the dynasty, because even throughout Chinese history, if an emperor lost too many big battles, got defeated by too many stupid barbarians, as they would usually be described, he was considered not worthy of the mandate of heaven, as they call, that which is bestowed on the head of state, whoever's ruling. And Xi is faced with a classic mandate of heaven, security situation. Can he hold on to it? And so, if you're going to game out China at war, you have to take that into account. He cannot pull the trigger. There's far more difficulty in China pulling the trigger than the West. And the West, of course, is not looking for a war, but they're also pushing back. And what you have to do is come up with ways to push back without opening fire. And the Chinese are coming to realize that. One reason they're waiting for the election is because if they get 4 more years of Trump, they realize this guy is used to playing our game. The art of whatever, the deal, whatever he calls it. But Trump has that ability. He is not a politician in Washington. He's a deal maker, a negotiator, somebody who gets it done. And the professional politicians hate that. And among the professional politicians who hate that are a lot of the Chinese politicians. So they're basically, treading water. After November, if there's a new government in the United States, then it's a whole new situation, new victory conditions, new this, new that. It'll change things one way or the other, especially on the military front.
Austin, how do you see things going?
Well, look, Jim gave a great lay down of some of the key elements, and the point he made about the military being the Army, the People's Liberation Army, the People's Liberation Army Navy, even though now they're calling it the Chinese Navy. They're a party army. They're not a national country army. They're a part of the party's enforcement apparatus, and that's a key to looking at one of the scenarios that I had sketched out in my column this week, which is China versus China. And that's what Jim was getting at too when he was talking about the mandate of heaven to rule, and that's also part of what Jim was talking about when he says China now has an emerged middle class that has interests that run counter to the authoritarian approach you get out of the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing. Something that Jim didn't touch on, but we have in other strategy talks, and certainly in print, is that China still is really about 6, depending on how you cut it up, 6 different Chinese countries, 4, 6, 7, and the chief example of this that I use when I have lectured about it just can look at southern China, Guangdong, Canton. That still has the highest provincial and regional GDP within China. And the southern dialect, Cantonese, Guangdongese, is unintelligible with northern, quote unquote, Mandarin, even though they can all read the same text. The dialects are dramatically different. That's even among the predominant ethnic group in China, which is Han Chinese. So Jim touched on all those social, historical components. But Jim, there's one thing I'm going to disagree with, and I'm disagreeing with it though in a what I will call a Chinese strategic context. You said don't fire the first shot. They've already fired the first shot, Dan, in the South China Sea, and it's been shots and buckets of concrete with those 7 manufactured, fabricated islands. They actually have more than that, but the fabricated islands built on sea features. And by the way, they're illegal under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. They're illegal under, I'm going to take a chance on this, Jim, about 2,500 years of maritime understandings among nations that with merchant fleets and even naval fleet navies. That's an invasion, a slow invasion that they really began in the early 1990s. Some of this we've covered in Strategy Talk. I lay a lot of it out in about a page and a half in the introduction of the Dragon Revives chapter of Cocktails from Hell, too. It's just they began by just putting up quote unquote weather reporting stations on sea features or concrete on top of a reef, and they were doing it for everyone's benefit. Of course, now you see what they've created are islands with at least 3 of them have airfields capable of handling high-performance aircraft. Maybe all of them have some type of air base on them. And even though China said they would not militarize them, as we've discussed in the past, they've emplaced anti-ship missiles, surface-to-air missiles on the island. So they've got, if you think of them, well, they're bastions is really what they are. They're not immobile aircraft carriers. They're bastions with weapons that are designed, and Jim pointed this out in a strategy talk we had a couple of years ago, to get, if someone moves in there on the surface, to get them in a missile crossfire, and also because of the bases that they are able to extend their air cover away from mainland China. So I say they've made the first shot, and they've been successful at it because they've taken territory. It's an imperialist, an imperialist move, classic Chinese imperialism, because they did it slowly. They largely did it, for the most part, with very little loss of life. There has been loss of life. There's loss of life too, because there were a couple of attacks they made in the Paracels, which is in the northern part of the South China Sea, where they drove the Vietnamese off of islands that have arguably been Vietnamese at least for 500 years. But then again, China has the naval superiority and air superiority, certainly in that region over the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese weren't able to respond. I mentioned Vietnam because the Vietnamese have been working since about that time very steadily to try to become at least a strategic ally of the United States. They need a big boy to stand up to the local regional bully, China. So there's a first shot, except it was against Vietnam. It fit in with the way the Chinese want to frame this struggle, and that is bilaterally. They want to be able to just take on Vietnam. They want to be able to just take on the Philippines. They want to go one-on-one with Taiwan. They want to go one-on-one with Japan. And they do it not simply militarily, economically, and culturally. Understand too, and this is something else we've talked about, that their Coast Guard and their fishing fleets, they have what they've called their sea militia. It's their fishermen move in, and then the Coast Guard comes and protects them. This fits in with what they call their cabbage strategy, all these little leaves of cabbage around whatever their goal is, and then overfly it with long-range reconnaissance aircraft. And then the boats, the fishing boats, steal fish, among other things, but they establish a presence in an area. And the next thing you know, here comes another barge fleet building another sea feature. Let me back up just for a second. They've had pushback on this assault. 2016, the arbitration court in The Hague, in Holland, ruled on a case that the Philippines, I think the Philippines actually filed it in 2013, and it dealt with resource theft as well as intrusion on territorial waters. And specifically, the big point is this area is in our exclusive economic zone, EEZ. That goes beyond the 12-mile water that goes out. Well, in a place like the South China Sea, it's almost a puzzle because you've got colliding or intersecting EEZ claims, but they're pretty well worked out. There's some debate that goes on between Malaysia and the Philippines and Brunei and Cambodia, Vietnam, and the like, but it's not a Chinese EEZ, except that China claims that it is, and they have legal rights all the way down. This is their so-called 9-dash line that they promote diplomatically, and it's part of their narrative warfare. It's all manufactured and made up as fabricated as the islands. But to get back to that case, the Philippines presented it, and that the arbitration ruling, and it was set up under the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which China signed. Of course, China signed the Sino-British agreement about Hong Kong, and they just totally broke that. About 98% of what the Philippines had claimed, the court recognized it, including the resource theft as well as the illegal intrusion on Filipino EEZ. Now that's pushback. What did China do? And the way they prefer to fight in the South China Sea, it's us, the local power, the regional power, the bully, versus the smaller power. They just ignored it. Well, here's Jim was talking about what the Trump administration does. The pushback, the United States really stepped back on this. And even though working with the Philippines and the other Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN as it's called, understand that that's not an alliance. It's got some elements of an alliance, but you have Cambodia in it, and Cambodia in some ways it behaves like a wholly owned subsidiary of China, but that's again another story. Not so with Malaysia or Vietnam or the Philippines or Indonesia on that, or Singapore, especially Singapore. The U.S. position was we're for freedom of navigation. And there's some pushback there because China was going around. This was the shtick. If you flew over or near these manufactured islands, you were entering Chinese sovereign airspace. Or if you were sailing you're passing within 12 miles of them, as if they were, the sovereign Chinese territory, which they're not by any measure. You had to have permission. And the U.S. pushed back. And on that point, when they first started trying to do it, and that precedes 2016, was we're just going to sail by there and we'd have the Navy conduct what's called a FONOP, freedom of navigation operation, which it's military, but it's diplomatic warfare as well. And just sail through there and what are you going to do? China a couple of times has had warships and Coast Guard come very close to American destroyers when they were conducting a FONOP. So that's not the first shot, but a ramming incident is a type of shot. We know that. So the pushback really on the Filipino case, as far as the U.S. is concerned, it starts with the Trump administration. You see some actions taken in 2018. But now, look, last week and earlier this week, that we're recording this, the State Department's sanctioned that big Chinese construction company, Chinese Communications Construction Corporation. I'm doing that off the top of my head. Sanctioned it because that outfit has been responsible for a lot of the island building in the South China Sea, and it has senior officers and suppliers that can be not put out of business by the United States, but there are ways we can crimp their capability to build, to operate, not just in the South China Sea, but everywhere in the world. That's a money shot by the United States. It should have happened in 2016, really, or 2017, but there was still some attempt, and that's me looking back. And that's me making a statement in hindsight, Dan. I realize that, but that Hague ruling and China's refusal to acknowledge it and essentially say, we're tough, we're just going to stand pat, was a signal about the way China has fought this slow war that's already going on in the South China Sea. Now we're going to hold it. The thing is, as Jim laid out darn well, the situation, well, sketch the situation, the military situation in there. I'm coming now back with some of the diplomatic, political, economic tussling that's going on. It's a war already, Dan, and it depends on what you want to call a shot. Now, I want to make a comment about that DF-21D anti-carrier ballistic missile, and then Jim, there's an updated version, DF-26 or something like that.
No, the 26 is just an IRBM. Okay. The only guided one is the DF-21, which has gone through several upgrades, but it's never been shown to actually work.
All right. See, the thing is that they could test it in the way that Jim has said, but that's not really the acid test. The acid test is firing it at something that's not only maneuvering, just but has anti-missile capabilities as well, detection and response. In other words, they were going to have to, if they're going to fire that thing, they're going to be coming up against U.S. Navy BMD, ballistic missile defense warships with a SM-3 Standard Missile 3 carrying it, and also all kinds of other little things. We're in this deploying, they're not little things, weapons to take down not just sea skimming missiles, but in ballistic missiles. The SM-3 is part of the missile defense umbrella, and for Guam, Hawaii, Japan, they'd have to do that to convince me that they've really got a carrier killer.
Yeah. Now, is that a normal warhead, or is it a nuclear warhead on that?
It's maneuverable, isn't it, Jim?
No, nuclear.
Yeah, it's a conventional warhead.
Conventional warhead. Okay.
Yeah.
But a warhead, hypersonic, ballistic missile incoming warhead would do enormous damage to a carrier. That there's no dispute about.
Well, right.
If it actually hits it might sink it. That's true.
Again, nobody's ever tested it, but
now
that's got to worry the Chinese more than us.
Jim,
it's not a threat. I'm just telling you, though, that there are things you can do to it. Plus, when they shoot it, watch what happens when you get the offensive, the counteroffensive response from the United States and Japan, South Korea, whoever else is in the region to hit Chinese missile launch sites along the coast. And as Jim pointed out, why this becomes unlikely is the Chinese have to break out, and they're going to be fighting minefields. If they want to mine the South China Sea, so how are they going to break through? It's not going to be the first island chain that they talk about. It's going to be the break out of their own coastline because of all the minefields running all the way from Shanghai to Hainan Island. It's they've got a lot of problems if it really becomes a shooting like this.
Now, Jim, isn't it more likely that the opening shots would be against maybe a Filipino patrol boat or a frigate?
Well, yeah, because that's lower risk, but there's still risk. A Chinese emperor, especially one in a precarious position like Xi, is very averse to risk because, and how should I put it? They have a different view of risks than in the West. They see risk as not, we have a thing called risk management, which should turn into a very powerful management tool. China doesn't really believe in it that much. They say risk should be avoided, not managed. And that's just the cultural mindset thing. So they don't want to get into a situation where things might get out of control. Control for a government, a police state is paramount, is obviously far more important than in, say, the United States or any Western country where there's often a lot of chaos. But that's part of that's part of a democracy. It's not part of a communist police state. And they especially want to avoid this if there are foreigners involved. Now, they have tried to buy the Philippines, literally, and that hasn't worked out too well. The opinions polls, keep coming out that the Filipinos trust Americans more than they trust Chinese. Well, no surprise, given the history of the Philippines and China, and especially Japan. And a lot of Filipinos see China as just another Japan, and they really want no part of it. They'll take the money, but they realize that the Chinese never deliver on what they say they will. There's always strings attached that they didn't know about. China is wearing out its welcome that it once had in the Philippines. Now, China would hope to neutralize active participation by the Philippines, but the Philippines really has no armed forces that can, do any real harm to China. The Philippines has improved its air and sea patrol capabilities with some new ships and new aircraft, and China complained when some of those ships and aircraft got too close to their 7 islands, as it were. But all's fair, and China also is upset that their aggressiveness, their activities in the South China Sea, have played a major role in getting a lot of former enemies to unite against them. South Korea and Japan are much closer allied than they ever have been in the past. Now, there are still fundamental, cultural hostilities, especially by Koreans against Japanese. But they realize that, it's our survival that's at risk here. So that they've been putting aside a lot of those ancient animosities.
They're not that ancient. That's the thing. I didn't.
Well, yeah, but I hesitate on that because actually they do go back a ways, but that's another story. But the bitterest memories are very recent, and they're the ones that count the most. The Chinese do act like a variation on the Japanese. Japanese are very racist. They believe there is the Nippon race, as it were. They were above everyone else. They could be polite to these barbarians, and they encountered a lot of Chinese in that. They respected Chinese culture, but they considered the current crop of Chinese leaders to be a bunch of buffoons and barbarians. This is during World War II, and since then that really hasn't changed. Now, fortunately for China, the Japanese are not reproducing, and they're slowly fading away. Of course, the Chinese are doing the same thing with all that prosperity. But what's important is the image that China has created for all of its neighbors. And basically, all of its neighbors hate them or fear them. It includes Russia, because Russia knows that China has claims on a lot of Russian Far Eastern territory, Vladivostok and all that, which they purposely did not renounce in the late 1940s and 1950s when the Russians asked them to. They just politely said, "Oh, well, we don't want to deal with that right now," et cetera, et cetera. In other words, they evaded it, and they have never renounced it. There have been quiet, discussions about, well, what are we going to do about this? And the Chinese say, well, we haven't decided yet. In other words, they haven't set a date for the invasion. The Chinese, of course, aren't going to invade, the Russian Far East because both countries have nuclear weapons. And even though China has adverse to any open warfare, they believe that they can basically do a leverage buyout of Eastern Russia economically. They have a lot of Chinese going in there as businessmen. There are a lot of the exports into Far Eastern Russia gets more of its manufactured goods from China than it does from the rest of Russia. And the Russians are well aware of this, that bit by bit, China will basically, control the Russian Far East by population and by economic links. And that's the way the Chinese roll. They're slow rollers. And it's worked for them in the past, and they still feel that it'll work for them in the future.
Well, and they've thought through this, too, because of all their actions in the Arctic. They're already portraying themselves as an Arctic power that got stymied, that they wanted to. In fact, is that Chinese construction company that's now been sanctioned by the State Department, was, if I correct on this, was involved in a proposal to build an airbase in northern Greenland, and that got shot down by the Trump administration. Of course, it was all muddied up in the way that it was reported by most of the mainstream media, but it was an attempt by China to use subtly, it was subtle the way they set it up, to use their diplomatic and economic power to gain a foothold in the Arctic. And you would see that come into play, say 20, 30, 40 years from now, when they have absorbed part of Siberia, where they could make a greater claim that, and I saying that, yes, with Jim sketched out, that's what they're up to in Siberia. Say, we've already had this presence. We're an Arctic nation, and it would roll back and say, look, base it on longevity, which they're coming close to already making that statement on the fact of their manufactured islands in the South China Sea. See, they're there. They're facts. We've got facts in the sea, not facts on the ground, or we've created ground in the sea. And then they come in with this barrage of diplomatic, legal, and also economic claims after putting that foothold out there. The danger, Dan, is you ask a question about the shootout with the Philippines. The danger is that there is an incident between a U.S. ally and China that escalates definitely between Chinese forces and American forces. But it's not just U.S. forces that are moving in and patrolling the South China Sea. Britain's going to have a small force operating in there. The Australians operate there. The Japanese are now sending small task forces, are adding a Japanese destroyer to an American operation in the South China Sea. And Singapore, even though it's small, is nothing to be ignored. First, because of its position, but it's, as you can see in the reporting on strategy page, they have a very competent, if small, high-tech military. And we haven't even brought India into this, Dan. I think, looking at the time on it, I'll be very quick about it, but I'll point out to the listeners a column I wrote, I think it was in April of 2001, and I remember Dan Masterson's reaction to this. It was called China's Boisterous Borders. It really hasn't changed. China has got a lot of enemies all the way around it, and as long as it's got money to keep buying off the elites, I called Cambodia a wholly owned subsidiary. Crooked Russians are part of what's allowing China to do what they're doing in Russia's far east. But as long as they've got that economic advantage, they're going to be able to gain the footholds economically, diplomatically, and even territorially that they desire. The problem is with India, there'll be real pushback, and the Indians are another example of what Jim was getting at. Of they've taken it, and they're not going to take it anymore. And if India has more in common with Australia and Singapore than it does with China by a long shot, and the Indians know that. India has more in common with the United States, and they've long known that. They just didn't want to admit it. And there's also the problem, too, of the way the United States was perceived as being pro-Pakistan, and one of the, was it the 71 war? I'm doing this off the top of my head. I think that's correct. But that's small, and compared to the problem of China developing an active alliance with the Pakistanis and that Gadar port that it looks like a Chinese naval base on the Indian Ocean. That's another shot of a type built with concrete and steel, but it's the Indians perceive it quite correctly as an encroachment on the Indian Ocean. Now, that's a heck of a lot of powerful enemies that China has riled. And I think Jim's, I'm kind of still chuckling about Jim's discussion about Koreans and Japanese. They really do train together. We're kind of the balancer between them, and the South Koreans and the Japanese have fabulous weapons, and their pilots know how to fly. And they also have missile defenses. All right, we're having this dance about what kind of more advanced anti-missile missiles Japan is going to deploy, but they're going to deploy them. And you saw the little problem that some of the South Korean peaceniks had when the THAAD was emplaced, just a THAAD battery in southern South Korea, but it really, that adds something to a South Korean defense against, certain types of a North Korean missile attack. But what it does is it also integrates the communication control and surveillance architecture. And the United States, South Korea, and Japan in that northern area, going on down to Okinawa, we've got an organization. It's not just the weapon systems, but they're organized to be able to focus not just on North Korea, but also China. And the Chinese are aware of that. That's something that ours works. Doesn't mean it can't be spoofed, but the Chinese would have to be very, very good. And I don't think they're that good to spoof or get the jump on that kind of surveillance system. And I've left Taiwan out of it. The Taiwanese are surveilling China all the time, much to the Chinese Communist Party's dismay. Recall one of the very first incredible international reports about the Wuhan virus, Chinese Communist Party virus, COVID-19, whatever you want to call it. I like calling it Chinese Communist Party virus, was from Taiwan. And it was because of their contacts and reporting within China. So the Wuhan virus, was that a first shot? No, there's some conspiracy debaters that suggest it was, but I'll tell you what, it certainly revealed something about the way the Chinese Communist Party handles information.
Yeah, and that's we're right there where we probably need to wrap it up. So that's probably a good place to end. We will talk to you gentlemen next time.
All right. 4 weeks. Bye-bye.
Yep.
Bye, guys. Take care.